Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live webcast on FAR and other regulations. I'm Jason Wetzel with Gabriel Enterprises, and I will be your moderator today. I'm also joined by a team of facilitators who will be providing presentation and technical support, as well as our featured subject matter expert, Shane McCall. Let's talk about the interactive features you can expect during the live webcast. Throughout the course, there will be opportunities for you to interact with the class and our presenters through live polling and asking questions. To receive full credit and your certificate of completion, please be sure to participate in those polling activities, and your certificate of completion will be available in your virtual learning environment profile upon completion of a live webcast session. If you have any questions as we're going through the content, we'd be glad to answer those. You can just click your Q&A button at any time there on the bottom of your screen. You'll notice that chat is disabled, but you can communicate with us through Q&A. There's also a live transcript feature that can be displayed there on your screen at the bottom of your screen. And just enabling that right now for you. Okay, also following today's session, you'll be redirected to a page with a link to the post-course survey. We tell you that now so you can be thinking about the type of feedback you'll provide to help us continually improve this training and your entire virtual learning experience. In addition to the live webcast, the virtual learning environment has multiple rooms you can visit. You'll definitely want to check out the Resource Center. In fact, I'd encourage you to maybe allot 15 minutes before and after each live session you attend to check out that Resource Center. There's a lot of helpful information there, a lot of practical advice and videos and things that we just can't pack into these 1-hour sessions. So we put them there so you can view them on your own time. Also, today's session will be recorded and placed in the live webinar's main theater within just a few hours of the live session ending. Finally, for technical assistance, if you're having technical difficulty during the webcast, you can use that Q&A box to explain what's happening, and someone on our team will provide you with one-on-one assistance. I do see we have a couple of questions coming in about certificates for some other courses, particularly the bids and proposals course. There was a small technical issue that we had there that we're looking into. So you should see those certificates for bids and proposals here relatively soon. Sorry about the delay on those. And before we go on, we just have a brief disclaimer here to share with you. We are covering some legal and regulatory subject matter in today's course, and one of our subject matter experts is an attorney. So just to avoid confusion and make sure we're as clear as possible, we're just providing this disclaimer here. I'll give you a brief moment to read that. All right, and then here we have a course roadmap, so you can see how we're going to help you through your 8A journey, all the way from the beginning of the program to the end of the program. And our goal is to help you meet your business goals at each stage of the 8A program. And we also want to help you shape a sustainable business that makes you successful beyond your 8A graduation. And Gabriel Enterprises, my firm, happens to be an 8A ourselves. So fortunately for you, we're not doing this on our own. We certainly have an understanding of the challenges involved in being an 8A, but as an 8A, we don't have all the answers. So we've assembled a team of experts in various disciplines, including former contracting officers and program managers, attorneys, like Shane, who you'll meet shortly, also proposal writers, business developers, accountants, senior executives from both government and large and small business. And several of our experts work with numerous successful small businesses. So we're able to draw on the experiences of those businesses as well. And we've taken all of this expertise and experience and packaged it into all the courses that you see listed here, as well as, I mentioned, several other resources in the virtual environment. So we really believe that we can position you for success. And if you see some courses here that pique your interest, we'll say the schedule right now is posted through June of 2022. I think just another week of courses yet in June, and then we'll be posting the July through September schedule before the end of June, and we'll be offering courses throughout the year. And as you saw there are 5 courses that are tailored to firms in the beginning of the 8A program, so the year 0 to 2 participant group. And today's course is one of those. Truly, any company doing business with the government should have a grasp of the material we'll cover today. And the goal of today's course is to help you understand where to look and how to interpret the regulations when you're faced with a particular issue. And for most, if not all, of the information we'll cover today, contracting officers and even some government program managers will assume that you know this stuff. So, as we know, communication issues abound when one party thinks or assumes that the other party knows something. So we're hoping to head off some of those future communication issues today. And then also, this knowledge can ultimately help you win and maintain federal business, which is not often something you think about whenever it comes to regulations, but it's certainly not just about staying out of trouble, but it's also about winning and maintaining that federal business. And here's a look at the training topics today. And as I'm going through this, if you don't see something that you'd like us to cover today, please chime in via that Q&A and we'll try to make sure we get to it. Take advantage of the live session today. Don't just listen to Shane and I drone on endlessly about any topic that you don't care about. But if you have a specific question or specific topic you'd like us to cover, please chime in with that. But otherwise, I'll start out by covering how the FAR and other regulations impact your business. Then we'll talk about getting to the right source and finding help. And then I'll do a brief deconstruction of the FAR in the short amount of time that we have. And I'll briefly describe the concept of contract vehicles as well. And then I'll turn it over to Shane. He'll cover competition guidelines and contract pricing and finish up with limitations on subcontracting and protests. So a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Feel free to ask questions as we go. And as always, you can return to the recorded content and view it at your own pace if you'd like to. All right, so let's talk about how the FAR and other regulations impact your business. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the regulations framework, and then I'll talk about a few roles for some of the key players from the government side. And also then I'll provide an overview of a few critical FAR parts that are relevant for developing your business and marketing to the government. So first, why is this FAR and regulation stuff that we're going to talk about today, why is it so important? Well, worst case, like I said, it's kind of about staying out of trouble. You're looking at fines and penalties, and in the worst cases, front page news stories and jail time. But short of that, you're looking at increased costs and missed opportunities if you don't know this stuff. And as I said earlier, the government kind of assumes that you do know the things that we'll talk about today. And it's also important to know where the regulations are designed to help small business. And we'll take a brief look at that today. Now, we're not trying to turn you into a FAR scholar with this course, certainly, but we do want you to know where to look when you're faced with a decision that involves regulations. And in the federal space, this happens pretty regularly. Now, I certainly wouldn't consider myself to be a FAR scholar. I actually find this stuff to be a little bit dry and boring, but I've been in federal contracting pretty much my entire career. Initially, that was as a contracting officer, then as a government program manager, and then consultant and business developer for both large and small business, and now have the pleasure of serving as COO for Gabriel Enterprises. And I hope to take that experience and narrow this information down to what you truly need to know. Like I said, I find it to be at times a little dry and boring. So let's focus on the stuff that matters the most. And I really love sharing what I've learned in this industry the past several years. And I hope to do a good job of sharing that with you today. And first, we're going to talk about getting to the right source and finding help. So let's examine where and how you can find information when you need it. As it says in red there, start with your contract. This is your primary guiding document. All the pertinent regulations from the FAR and agency FAR supplements are essentially summarized in your contract. Read it and understand it, and it will save you a lot of confusion. I know this can seem obvious and can seem kind of trite. What's this guy talking about? I'm sitting here for an hour. He's telling me just to read my contract. I can't even tell you, even as a former contracting officer, how many times I get involved in maybe a disagreement or trying to research a particular issue, and I start, down the path of search engine searches, looking all over the place, and forget to stop and see what's in the actual contract. And so many times coming back to that reality has saved me. So I'd really encourage you to do the same. In addition to the contract, you have the federal acquisition regulations. Includes it outlines your competition procedures that apply to nearly every government agency. It's also the source for most of your contract clauses. And we also have agency FAR supplements. Each agency has one of these. They explain where the agency is maybe a little more restrictive than, or where they deviate from the FAR. If you've heard of the DFARS, DFARS, that'd be the Department of Defense's agency FAR supplement. And then lastly, on this slide, GAO decisions, the Government Accountability Office. Their decisions can be a great source for understanding how the FAR and statutes are interpreted. It's one thing to kind of read the clause or read that section of the FAR, but you can get a lot more information on it if you look at a particular issue and how it was decided on by the GAO. And I'd look at maybe decisions by the Court of Federal Claims for similar reasons as well. A few more sources here. So the Code of Federal Regulations, we've kind of been talking about this already because the FAR is actually part of the CFR. It's section 48. And the FAR is kind of the playbook for government contracting officers. But those contracting officers aren't always familiar with another key part of the CFR that's very important for you, and that is CFR 13. That is where the SBA regulations are found. And I find the CFR to be incredibly helpful with the kinds of examples that it provides and scenarios. So definitely encourage you to look at that anytime you're facing an issue that involves small business regulations, CFR 13. And also here we have the TechFAR handbook. If you happen to be in the business of IT development or consulting, you certainly want to make sure that you or your customers are aware of the TechFAR. And it's not any alternate kind of FAR or anything like that. It just emphasizes the flexibilities that are in the FAR that really have always been there that allow for agile development to occur. And again, feel free to ask questions on any regulatory related topic as we're going through this. Okay, let's talk about a few key roles for government players. So we've been talking about the contracting officer a little bit, but let's just kind of define who that is. So in all cases, they have binding authority and sole authority. The contracting officer is the only person who can cause the government to incur costs, with some minor exceptions, namely the individual micro purchase threshold, which I believe is currently $10,000, and those are typically credit card buys. We're not talking about that. We're talking about your contracts here. So with that in mind, you want the contracting officer to be involved in any kind of discussion involving cost or scope, and you certainly don't want to take direction from someone that increases your costs unless that person is the contracting officer. You can be the government won't necessarily be liable, even if a government person told you to do something and you did it, you're just following orders. If it wasn't a contracting officer, the government isn't obligated to pay for that. Now, whenever I say involve the contracting officer, most of them are incredibly busy working on numerous different contracts, unless they're one contracting officer working on a large program. So involving them could mean something as simple as sending an email after a meeting that they couldn't attend to maybe document what happened or ask a clarifying question. They're typically not involved in those day-to-day activities. So if there is no cost impact, you generally don't need to bring them in. And I'd say too, when you do bring them in, be aware of the politics of that. You want to make sure that the customer, maybe the program manager or the contracting officer representative, who we'll talk about in a moment, make sure that they're in the loop as well. You're not kind of going around them to get to the contracting officer, unless there are some serious or systemic problems. Let's also talk about the contracting officer a little bit from a business development perspective. And this is an area where I think people can get tripped up, because often the contracting officer is the face of the procurement. You might only see their name on the RFP that comes out, for instance, and they're the one who signs the contract. So they have the authority. You certainly want their buy-in, they can provide reasons not to award to you. But if you're trying to engage the government before an RFP is issued, maybe trying to get your brand out there, getting them to fund an idea, you don't want to deal with the contracting officer. The contracting officer isn't going to drive the budget or anything like that. That will be typically a program manager or an executive within a particular office. And that brings us to the next role, the contracting officer representative. Now, this person is not always the program manager, but often they are, or they're someone who works for the program manager or works for an executive who you would want to talk to get your idea funded or get your brand out there, or maybe start the process of a sole source 8A. Often sole source 8As are started, the process is initiated by a program manager. Now, let's talk about the COR. They generally are more involved in the day-to-day workings of the contract. And I will say, too, there's a wide range of levels of involvement across agencies and even within certain agencies. Sometimes they're just a name and you barely see them. Other times they are, involved with you day to day, but generally they are more involved, certainly more than the CO. But unlike the CO, they have no authority to authorize you to incur costs that your contract doesn't already authorize you to incur. So they should be present for just about any meeting. If they aren't the end user, you'll certainly want to pull them in if an end user is asking you to do something out of the ordinary. So that's kind of the levels of involvement for the CO and the COR. Let's talk about the small business specialist, or also known sometimes as the Office of Small Business Programs when it comes to DoD, or one of my favorite acronyms in government, the OSDBU, that is the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. Regardless of the title, the people that sit in these kinds of roles are designated to be your advocate. They can introduce people to you, they can encourage meetings with you. They're typically, almost always, not involved in the day-to-day, and they again have varying levels of influence across agencies, but in all cases they do report, that the head person in this role, the head of the office, reports to the agency head or the deputy agency head. So they have a prominent role within the agency, and because of that they often do have quite a bit of influence. And the regulations are designed so that they have influence to really help small businesses out and make sure that small businesses are considered. But influence is one thing, actually being able to exercise that toward getting your foot in the door, or helping introduce you, are their COs and the agency receptive to them, or program managers receptive to them? You have kind of have to figure out. And if you find a good one who's well connected, you can spend a lot of your business development time kind of working with them to open the right doors. You can find their contact information on the agency websites and their acquisition and procurement section. Usually pretty easy to find, but they're also busy, so not always able to respond right away. All right, we're going to launch our first live poll of the day. Just a quick check-in, just to make sure we're coming across pretty clearly. So in this, we're asking, you're under contract to perform maintenance on 3 engines. So put yourself in that situation, and the contracting officer representative sends you an email authorizing you to perform maintenance on a 4th engine. What should you do next? Go ahead and select the best answer. I'll be silent for just another moment yet until we see the majority of responses coming in. And while we're waiting for the rest of those responses to come in, I'll go ahead and answer one outstanding question here. So the question is, does the CDC have a small business office? Offhand, I don't know. I would start looking at the CDC and see what you find on their website, on their acquisition procurement section of their website. If you don't find something there, I'd go up a level, which I believe is Health and Human Services. If that's not correct, you can certainly find out who their parent agency is through their website, and I would just go that route. So trying just, I think the general message there is starting with the most specific area of the agency that you want to work with, and then kind of working your way up. But I would think, given the size of CDC, that they probably have their own small business offices, or even if it's assigned by HHS, they probably have some people that only work with CDC. Okay, we have all our poll results in, or just about all of them. Awesome, looks like we're tracking. So most people answered, ask the COR to provide written authorization from the CO. You certainly could refuse to perform the work, but if you like doing business and continuing to do business, we think that A is the best answer there. All right, continuing on to deconstructing the FAR. And this next slide here, we do have in the Resource Center, as it slowly appears on the screen here, there's a 5-minute video overview of this slide in the Resource Center. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today. The general message here is that a contract action or issue will generally be governed by a certain FAR part or parts based on dollar value and a series of decisions made by the CO up to that point. So this map can kind of help you know what FAR part to pay attention to, as indicated in the light blue under each one of the boxes. And then it can kind of become your rule book or playbook. And the other sections for that particular issue, you can kind of ignore. So in that way, it helps you. Now, we are going to spend a little time here breaking down the FAR. It is a giant document. I don't know how many megabytes it is in PDF form, but when I first started as a contracting officer, it was 2 giant red binders on my desk, probably, I don't know, 2.5 inches thick each, about 10 pounds each. So a lot of documentation there. We're just going to dive into a few of the most important sections when it comes to just generally doing business with the government. So first, acquisition of commercial items. And as we go through these, the FAR part that we're talking about is indicated in blue and light blue in the upper right corner of the slide. So now everything the government buys is classified as commercial or other than commercial. And that decision then governs several other procedures and decisions. And when you're trying to understand what commercial items are when it comes to doing business with the government, it helps to consider the opposite, which would be non-commercial items other than commercial items. And a lot of times this would be things like missiles and weapon systems, printing money legally, things that are only purchased by the government. And when we're not buying things like that, we are using commercial item procedures that should resemble what you see in the commercial marketplace as an everyday consumer or business. Now, certainly they're not identical. It is still the government, but these commercial item procedures are applied in more situations than you might think, because they're not just commercial off-the-shelf items, but they include items of a type of commercial as well. And that can get a little bit confusing. We don't have time to dive into it today, but if you want to check out the information under that commerciality test there, you could get a really good sense of whether what you're selling is commercial or other than commercial. But why do you care anyways? Well, the competition process and the terms and conditions are far less burdensome for commercial items. And anything that drives up admin burden, drives up costs, also eats away profits. So certainly want to know from that perspective, but it also really helps to know if a disagreement maybe with your customer or a particular issue with the government is governed by commercial or other than commercial terms and conditions. And this is a case where people incorrectly reference non-commercial clauses quite often because maybe they're facing a particular issue like termination and they plug that into their favorite search engine, termination federal government or termination federal acquisition regulations. And what comes up, I don't know if it's still the first result, but what might come up is the non-commercial clause. And you start looking at that and okay, I can see how this can be applied. And meanwhile, you have a commercial contract and you're looking at the wrong clause. The commercial termination procedures are much different than non-commercial. And there are several examples like that. Well, how do you know if your RFP or your contract is for commercial items? Surprise, read the contract. And in this case, it's actually really easy to find. It should be on the cover sheet. You should see the commercial item clauses 52.2 212 as well. So yeah, really easy to find, and then make sure you're looking at the right clauses there. All right, and I'll go ahead and answer a quick question on commercial items, just while it's still relevant. So if I have to acquire a hose under a government contract, is the acquisition of the hose governed by the guidebook? If I'm understanding that correctly, so if the government was buying a hose, that would be commercial items. But if you are buying, maybe from subcontractors, a hose, that you wouldn't have to follow, some of the competition procedures and that sort of thing. It does have to be a fair and reasonable price that you're passing on to the government. And maybe I'll let Shane answer that in writing if I've butchered that. But I think I'm on the right track initially, but we could also get some clarification there. Let's talk about acquisition of non-commercial items. So again, these are supplies and services only sold to the government. So weapon systems, printing money, that sort of thing. There is no FAR part called non-commercial items. So the entire FAR essentially applies with a few exceptions, namely FAR Part 12 that we were just talking about. Now, an area where there are significant differences between commercial and other than commercial is costs and pricing, and that's why we're calling out FAR Part 31 here. For commercial items, the government generally trusts that the market is taking care of making sure the price is fair and reasonable. So capitalism, competition, all that is making sure that the price is fair and reasonable. So there's generally not a need for providing cost buildup information in commercial item procurements, with a few exceptions. And for non-commercial items, though, there is a need to provide that because you don't have the competitive marketplace that's taking care of making sure the prices are fair and reasonable. So FAR Part 31 provides the rules for things like cost proposals and tracking costs during performance. All right, thank you, Shane, for taking the rest of that question in writing. So next we're going to talk about simplified acquisition procedures. Now, these are discussed in FAR Part 13. They are less burdensome than negotiated procurement, which we'll talk about in a little bit, as well as sealed bidding. Certainly great for small business. Again, less burden, less resources to get a contract in place, and a significant portion of simplified acquisitions go to small business because of what's called the rule of two. And what that says is, for a procurement that's less than the simplified acquisition threshold, which I believe is still $250,000, the contracting officer must justify their decision not to set it aside for small business by proving that there are less than 2 small businesses that can do the job. If they could have worded that any more convoluted, or in any more of a convoluted way, it'd be great. But I think you get the picture. If there are 2 small businesses that can do it, it has to be set aside for small business. And that's often why you'll see these sources sought notices come out, and you want to make sure that you respond to those. And the other thing I'll say too here is that it doesn't just apply to under 250,000. The spirit of that same rule applies to all acquisitions. Contracting officers just have a good bit more latitude over 250,000, so you don't see the set asides as much, but they're supposed to look to set it aside for small business first, essentially. All right, just a couple more sections for me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Shane. So contracting by negotiation. This is kind of the grandfather of all competition procedures. If you read it and understand it, you'll have a sense of what the government is up to when it comes to conducting procurements for all different types of acquisitions. Except for sealed bidding, all the other types that we talked about are essentially a trimmed down version of FAR Part 15, contracting by negotiation. Now, with a FAR Part 15 procurement, it's important to know where you are in the process so that you can act accordingly. And also, Shane's going to talk about protests in a little bit, and it's important to know which stage you're in so you can file a timely protest if you were considering doing that. But let's go through these stages just quickly. So clarifications. This would be the contracting officer reaching out to you after you submit your proposal and asking you to correct a mistake or provide more information on your past performance. Next, the competitive range. This would be the government down selecting to a fewer number of offers than were originally submitted. And if you are in the competitive range, you'll receive a notice saying you're in. If you're out, you'll receive a notice saying you are out. And this is required by the government prior to moving on to discussions or negotiations, right? They don't want to be negotiating with you, wasting your time, wasting their time, unless you have a realistic chance of getting a contract award. Now, in discussions or negotiations, the government has to tell you your significant weaknesses, so you don't want to ignore anything there. It could be technical and price, and they oftentimes are in writing. Don't think that there will always be a meeting there. And then hopefully we move on to award. All right, before we go into the next topic on contract vehicles, I'm going to go ahead and launch a live poll for you. So in this scenario, if the Environmental Protection Agency, and we just picked an agency at random there, I'll give you a hint, the agency has nothing to do with it, but if they have an existing multiple award IDIQ, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment, where can you find task order RFQs to respond to? And I'll give you a moment to respond there. All right, just take a little more time here. All right, we're well over the majority of responses in. So I'm going to continue on to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about contract vehicles, and then we'll come back to talk about that poll and kind of what the meaning is behind it. So what are these contract vehicles? They come by many different terms. IDIQ and BPA we mentioned in the poll. You might also hear things like MATOC, Multiple Award Task Order Contract, GWAC, Government-Wide Acquisition Contract. It's kind of alphabet soup here. But mainly these are contracts that are awarded to one or more companies, and then task orders are awarded under those contracts. And a significant portion of the government spending is headed in this direction because it helps reduce the government's level of effort and presumably helps them get better pricing as well. Now, I'll go ahead and send the poll results, and we'll kind of talk about how these work. So we talked about where can you find RFQs to respond to. It looks like about 81% of you said sam.gov opportunities. That's not correct. I'm not surprised at all that that's what you answered before we went through this slide, but let's talk about that. And that's the second section here. You can't play if you aren't on the field. So the original contract vehicle, so BPA or IDIQ, is first offered up for competition using one of the procedures that we already discussed, right? And then once that is awarded to one or more companies, task orders are issued to only the companies on the contract vehicle, right? And that's what we're talking about with this green box here off to the right, the top green box. Now, the only way to get on that vehicle is through that initial RFP that comes out, or they might have what's called on-ramping, which is kind of maybe after a few years of the contract being in place, they give other companies an opportunity to get on the contract vehicle. But other than that, if you're not on the contract, you don't have any ability to participate. You will not see any of the RFQs or RFPs associated with those task orders on the contract after that contract vehicle's out there, right? So a lot of times you go to an industry day, virtual or in person, or maybe talk with a contracting officer and they'll say, hey, you got to go to sam.gov to do opportunities or to see any opportunities with us. That's true. That's for the publicly available opportunities, but I think it's a significant portion. It's 1/3 back in 2011 to 2015. I'd say it's even more than that now are awarded on these contract vehicles, and you're not going to see those. So you want to start to position your company now, if you're not on those vehicles, to get on those vehicles. And in several of our other courses, we kind of talk about how you can find the data to see if agencies are buying on vehicles and then how to start to position yourself to be on those vehicles. It's definitely something you want to consider, especially when you are still in 8A. All right, so we have a brief Q&A break here, but it looks like Shane and I have been able to keep up with all the questions so far, so I'm going to quickly turn it over to Shane, allow him to introduce himself, and then take us through these last few topics.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason and Gabriel Enterprises, for allowing me to present today. I enjoy these sorts of things as an attorney. We kind of like reading through regulations or reading through cases. That's one of the things that gives us a little pleasure in life. So I'm happy to share some of that insight with you. We're a boutique firm, small firm that focuses on federal contracting and small businesses. Coprince McCall Potroff is the name of the firm. And we also have a blog, smallgovcon.com. We put updates on there, so always a good resource for you if you need, extra resource. What's, small business updates, FAR updates, that sort of thing. We put them on there. We don't have much time today, so I'm going to kind of give you overviews of a lot of these different topics. You can get the lay of the land, figure out what things I need to know more about, what things I kind of understand already, what things I need, to hire someone for or get additional insight on. We'll jump into first. Competition guidelines. And what I want to do with each of these is what I try to do is give you a nice example for each one to sort of take it home, give you something to latch onto. But overall, how does the government conduct procurements? The most common ways is either going to be LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable, or best value trade-off. LPTA has kind of been discouraged from some recent FAR updates have said, don't use LPTA unless it fits certain circumstances. So you're not going to see it that often unless it kind of depends on your industry though. Certain industries, it's going to be very common if it's viewed as a less complicated or a simple task where there's a commercial market for it. It's all been sort of, the government doesn't care as much about having a novel solution or something like that. Like IT services, that's most often going to be a best value. Construction, just because of the way its bid can be, is often an LPTA if it's a sealed bid, but it can also be an IDIQ like Jason was talking about where it's best value. So you really have to, again, look at the solicitation criteria. The solicitation criteria are very important, the evaluation criteria. Obviously, if it's an LPTA, they're just looking at who's the lowest price, has that company met all the pass-fail criteria, and then as long as it's a responsible contractor, that contractor is going to get the award. Different than a best value where sometimes the government is looking for specific advantages, something that goes above and beyond the minimum standards, and you can get strengths for that sort of thing. A successful protest, we'll talk about a little bit about protests, might be that you looked at the solicitation criteria as a contractor, you were very clear that you met all of those, and the government didn't follow its own rules. It didn't follow its own rules of the road in evaluating your proposal, and therefore you may have grounds for a protest. A real basic example of that, but I've seen similar things. The government says, okay, you need to provide past performance examples, 3 past performance examples. They all have to be over $5 million in value of the contract that you performed on. You provide one that's $5.1 million, and then you get back evaluation or notes from the government that says, okay, you didn't, that past performance example did not meet that $5 million criteria, even though you clearly provided an example that was over $5 million. So that would be the government not following its own evaluation criteria and may be grounds for protest. So you got to know the evaluation criteria going in to make sure you meet them. And you got to know the evaluation criteria when you see what the government's evaluation is to make sure the government also follow its own rules. Because this is the government buying, everyone's got to play by a common playbook, a common set of rules, and it has to be a level playing field for all those offerors that are on that particular solicitation. Of course, you've got to be responsive. We get calls frequently, and you see cases on, for instance, GAO bid protest decisions where people did not submit a timely proposal or missing one particular component. And that's just an easy way to get eliminated from a competition for a fairly minor issue in some cases. And it's not based on the quality or substance of your proposal. It's based on missing one of the required components, kind of an administrative component, but you will commonly or almost always get eliminated for that reason, and there's not a great recourse for it. So don't let that, I mean, try not to have that be the reason you get eliminated. You want to be eliminated on the merits, of course. Debriefings, you should always ask for a debriefing. That is a opportunity for you to ask questions to the government about the evaluation. The government in most solicitations is required to provide one, but you have to ask right away. You get 3 days from notice of elimination to request that. So always do that. You may get differing amounts of information depending on the agency, depending on the procurement, but more information is always better. And you can request one if you win. You can learn a little bit more. Maybe there were some aspects of your proposal that weren't perfect, even though you were the winning proposal. So always ask for that information. Certain solicitations, you only get a brief explanation. It's not as much information, but you can still request it. So you should always take advantage of that when you can. Someone asked about a proposal being eliminated because of something like font size. I have seen that. What you need to do if that happens, look very closely at the solicitation criteria again. Did it, was there aspects of it that were unclear about font size? But I've definitely seen that in my practice in the last year. I don't know the statistics, but it's pretty common. Lateness, of course, you're going to be eliminated, and I've seen it for font size or going over the page amount. Again, if you may have an argument that the solicitation allowed it, so make sure you look very closely at the solicitation criteria if you get that sort of letter that says you were eliminated because of font size. But I've seen those letters, and you may have a reason to question it, or it may be that you just didn't follow the instructions correctly. Okay, contract pricing. I'll just mention this briefly. There's kind of two main types of contract pricing. Firm fixed price is the majority, pretty much the vast majority of contracts that the government issues. That is the most preferred method of pricing for the government to use. And it's probably the simplest, the easiest to understand. You offer a firm fixed price to the government. You have to deliver these services or other items at that, and you get paid that fixed price. If you are able to deliver them for less than that price, then you can make a profit on the difference. The other aspect of that, though, is that the risk is on the contractor if prices go up. And a recent example of this we've seen, and I've got questions about it, inflation has caused prices to go up. COVID has caused supply prices to go up. People ask us, what can you do in that situation? If it's a firm fixed price contract, the government's initial answer will always be, sorry, it's a firm fixed price contract. You have to eat those costs. You're responsible for performance. You may have a way to try and argue and ask at the discretion of the contracting officer for an adjustment, but there's no guarantee of that. In fact, the Department of Defense just issued guidance that reiterated, we don't really care that prices went up. We're sorry about it, but we will stick to the firm fixed price that was originally in the contract. The Department of Defense did say they will try to think about having contracting officers put what's called an economic price adjustment clause into future contracts, but they're not going to retroactively put that clause into an existing contract. So you do have to think about that when you're putting together your pricing. That's why either you or you have someone skilled at your office that is the price estimator and is really careful with putting the pricing together, because you can't change it later on a firm fixed price contract. So shorthand for that is the risk of loss is on the contractor in a firm fixed price contract, and always something you got to think about. The other main type of contract price, cost reimbursement and labor hour, both of these do not have a total firm fixed price. There's different kinds of cost reimbursement. What I would say, my take home message, if you're going into cost reimbursement or labor hour or time and materials type contracts, you will have to have to follow the FAR Part 31 contract pricing principles, which are quite complicated. I would advise you, if you're not already very familiar with those, to maybe hire an accountant or a consultant who can advise you on those. make sure your accounting system is geared and set up to follow those principles, and also to be able to produce data if the government asks for it to show why your pricing is reasonable and meets all the other rules. One main difference, cost reimbursement, basically, you're getting your costs reimbursed by the government, within reason. But it's your actual cost that it costs you to perform a contract. The difference with labor hour is you have a set labor rate that the government has already agreed to. So I guess in that aspect, the labor rate has been fixed, but the number of hours is determined by the amount of time it takes the contractor to perform it. So obviously there's a potential here to maybe make more money on these sorts of contracts, but you have to go into it very carefully. And the government uses them in limited situations, usually where something is a newer complex system. The government is not sure exactly how the solution can be arrived at, so the contractor has to come up with that. But if you're in that sort of industry, in research and development, I've seen it for sure. You're coming up with new technologies or something. If that's something your company is going into, then you may be in the cost reimbursement realm, and you have to get very familiar with that, hire professionals to help you with it. Okay. So that's a real brief look at costing, different types of costs, setups for contracts. So limitation on subcontracting and protests. Limitation on subcontracting is a fairly simple concept, but you got to know it before you start the contract, and you got to even know it before you start teaming and setting up some budgets with your teaming partners. And the idea is, if it's a small business contract, including an 8A contract, the government doesn't want the 8A contractor to get the contract and then just have some non-8A company perform all the work. So we're going to hit you with a scenario first, with a quick poll, and then I'll go through some of the basics of limitation on subcontracting. We'll see where people are at. In this scenario, we have a company, Wiley Company, that's got an 8A sole source award. It's a $100,000 contract, and it's providing consulting services. So it's a services contract for the Department of Commerce. Wiley employees perform 400 hours on the contract, and then Wiley can't perform all of it itself. It wants to use a subcontractor that is a non-8A company that's going to do part of the work. That subcontractor is called Roadrunner, and Roadrunner performs 100 hours. So Roadrunner is performing a lot less hours than Wiley. So you can see the poll there. Wiley pays $55,000 to Roadrunner. Did Wiley violate its limitations on subcontracting clause? I'll give you a minute to respond to that question. And again, my advice with limitation on subcontracting, this presentation and your own, research can advise you the rules. If you're working with a subcontractor or multiple subcontractors, you got to basically set up pro forma budgets to kind of get an estimate how much work your company as the prime contractor will do, how much work subcontractors will do. Have that set up as early as you can, once you know what the particulars are. So we have to pull back, and about 3/4 of people said yes, they violated it, and that is the correct response. Limitation on subcontracting looks at the dollar amount. Because the subcontractor got 55% of the total amount paid by the government, that is over the 50% amount that is the limit on subcontracting. So they did violate it in that case. Okay, and I'll go through those rules really quick for those who don't know them or need a refresher. Okay, first thing you gotta do is limitation on subcontracting. Are you in the services industry? Are you in the construction industry? Those are the most common. Some people may be in supplies. That's when you're actually manufacturing a product though. So that's, a limited subset of companies. A lot of people in the services industry, you can pay no more than 50% of the amount paid by the government to subcontractors that are not similarly situated. What that means is, if it's an 8A contract, and you happen to have an 8A subcontractor, it's treated as if it's not subcontracted. And normally you're not going to have an 8A subcontractor, but if that's the case, you need to look at the similarly situated rule. If you're in the construction industry, it is a different percentage. That's the key takeaway here. General construction, you can subcontract 85% of the contract value after you exclude cost of materials. Specialty trade contractors, in that situation, you can subcontract up to 75% of the amount paid by the government after excluding cost of materials. So, you just have to figure out, am I in the services industry or am I in a construction industry? And that's based on the NAICS code assigned to the contract by the contractor. And once you sort of get used to this concept, then you'll know it for future contracts. You just kind of got to remember that, okay, small business set aside or 8A set aside, I have to remember the limitation on subcontracting. And note that it is the contracting officer and the agency that's going to enforce this. And so they have the right to say, okay, show me how you're meeting the limitation on subcontracting, show me your backup documentation. So always have that in your file so you are ready to produce that if you need to. Okay, and I want to spend a little time on protests so you just know what's out there. As Jason mentioned, the protests, I mean, even if you're not filing protests and not getting protested, the protest decisions do offer a little bit of guidance for how the government has to interpret its own solicitation. So there can be value to knowing the protest system, even if you think, I'm never going to protest, I don't want to protest. It's still a body of law that informs the government and offerors how to read solicitations, how to interpret them, and how the government has to apply the FAR and other rules. So it's still out there. So a protest, it's a way to challenge different aspects. Terms of a solicitation, we sometimes call that a pre-award protest. That means you are challenging the evaluation criteria or the way the government has defined the procurement. You can also do that it's not a protest, but you can do that informally through questions and answers to a contracting officer. And, that's an easier and cheaper way to do it. So you definitely, if you have a question, like you see a term in a contract, or excuse me, in a solicitation that doesn't meet your knowledge of the industry or is not well defined enough that you know how to respond to it, you either go through the formal question and answer that if the government provides that, or you can email the contracting officer or ask them that question. It's possible they realize there was a bit of an ambiguity and they fix it and amend the solicitation. So that's the easy way to do it. You can also protest that to different places. You can do a formal protest through the agency, through the Government Accountability Office or Court of Federal Claims. You can also challenge, if you see a fellow contractor that you think that is not eligible for an award based on size status, or in some cases socioeconomic status, you can challenge that. Those will go through different, normally be filed with the contracting officer, but they're going to go through and be administered by the Small Business Administration. Interesting note, you cannot challenge the 8A status of an awardee. You can challenge other socioeconomic statuses, but not 8A statuses. So just so you are aware of that. And then once there is an award, you can say your company did not get the award, you can protest to question the agency's evaluation. And that would be done at the agency level, GAO or Court of Federal Claims. That is either challenging that the evaluation of the awardee was not correct, or the evaluation of your own proposal was not correct. And those can be hard to win. And so, of course, you get information from the debriefing. If there's a good debriefing, it may either give you information that makes you say, okay, maybe I want to protest, or it may give you information that says, okay, now I learned I need to do better on my next proposal. So this is not the correct one to protest because I know why I did not get the award in that situation. So they can be very complicated. So you may want to consider legal assistance, or just make sure you know the rules before you're getting into them. I mentioned some of this already, but protests at GAO can be considered successful because the agency will often take corrective action. Maybe that means the government realizes they have an ambiguous or a poorly defined term in a solicitation, and they go back and amend the solicitation. Maybe that means, for instance, we've seen this in the VA has to set aside service disabled veteran owned small business contracts, for instance, if there's two or more SDVOSBs that can do the work, or as Jason mentioned, a agency has to set aside a contract for small businesses if there's two or more small businesses that can do the work. You can actually protest if you see an unrestricted procurement and you're very aware there's a dozen small businesses that can do the work and are capable of doing it. You can actually protest and say that should be a small business set aside. And if all those facts are true, the government may decide, okay, we're going to take corrective action. We're going to look at this, and then they reissue this solicitation as a small business set aside. Now, that does happen with some frequency. So that's a sort of basic example of challenging the terms of the solicitation. Now, if you get protests, on the other hand, you do have the right to be involved if it's at GAO or Court of Federal Claims. If it's an agency level protest, you don't really get a chance. As far as reputation and protest, I would say the protest, it has to be the right situation. There's plenty of successful companies that do protest pretty frequently, but you don't want to make, you don't want to bring protests that are frivolous. And you also want to focus on protecting sort of, you're challenging the agency, but what your focus is protecting the level playing field of the federal procurement space. I think if you keep that focus in mind, you're not going after one particular contracting officer. You're not going after the agency, really. You're sort of saying, hey, everyone's got to be on a level playing field, and it's my job to kind of protect that and uphold the government playing by the rules. Now, of course, there's, I assume you could take it too far and protest too much. So it's a very serious decision. And I don't think a contracting officer, because it's a legal right and a valid right, they should not hold that against someone. But again, that can, I can't guarantee that. And it a little bit depends on each individual contracting officer. But they've seen so many protests that they're aware that's going to happen in some cases, and they're used to it in many cases. So you can, one thing to keep in mind, if you think there's a problem with the solicitation evaluation criteria or ground rules, you have to challenge that before the due date for proposals. That's just a good takeaway from protests. We can't go into all the details, but if you think there's a problem with the solicitation criteria, that sort of thing has to be protested before proposal due date. All right, and I will turn it over to Jason to take us out of here, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Shane. And on that topic of protests and debriefings, I thought that was a really good response to that question that we often see about there being possible reprisal or reputational risk as a result of protesting. The other thing I would add to that, and we're talking about debriefings a little bit today, I'd really encourage you to go into a debriefing with an attitude of, how can we use this to improve our next proposal, and not an attitude of, how can we find something here that we can protest, something that wasn't fair. As a former contracting officer who's been on the other side of the table from people who have that posture, you can smell it like garlic. Like it's just so obvious, the questions that are being asked and the posture in the room, that they're just trying to find something that was wrong. But whenever companies come in with an attitude of, hey, like we lost, we're just going to try to figure out how to get this right next time, I think many other contracting officers are also much more open with information, right? You want as much information as you can so that you can improve your future proposals. So definitely encourage you to come in with that kind of attitude. I'm not going to dive into all these do's and don'ts. It's really just a summary of many of the things that we talked about today. Because we are at the top of the hour, I'm just going to move to close out, we also don't have any outstanding questions. Thank you for your questions today. Really insightful questions. Lets me know that you are on the right track with your federal contracting business. Thank you again for this hour that you spent with us today. Really hope this was helpful as you consider where to look and how to interpret the regulations. Hopefully we were able to narrow it down to those few regulations and aspects of the regulations that really matter to you. Today's session was recorded and will be available in the live webinars main theater within just a few hours. And after we close out of the course, you'll be redirected to a page with a link to the post-course survey. That's kind of easy to miss, so I went ahead and posted the post-course survey link in the chat here as well. And then after you take a couple minutes to complete that survey, browse around the virtual environment. Again, I'd encourage you to always allot maybe 15 minutes after the session to check out the resource center, the specific items that we mentioned, and anything else that you see that might be helpful for you. Your certificate will be available in your virtual learning environment profile within just a few hours. And again, if you have issues with previous courses, especially that bids and proposals course certificate, we're working on getting that corrected. You should see that one hopefully by the end of this week. And then if you don't see your certificate today, or if you have any other questions, please email us at support@geconsultinggroup.com. Thank you and enjoy the remainder of your day.